The scream came from the eastern gate before the sun had even risen, and Mira froze with a tray of bread halfway to the servants' table, her heart slamming against her ribs. Something was moving in the dark beyond the palace wall, something large enough to make 2 grown guards drop their spears and run. She did not know yet that this single moment would change the entire shape of her life, but her body seemed to understand before her mind did, because her hands would not stop shaking. Mira had worked in the palace kitchens of Aldervane for 3 years, ever since her parents died in the fever that swept through the lower village, and left her with nothing but a small room above a bakery, and a debt she could never fully repay. She was 22, plain in the way that made people forget her face after they had spoken to her, and she preferred it that way. Being forgettable meant being safe. Being safe meant surviving. The head cook, a broad woman named Clara, with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her hands, grabbed Mira by the shoulder and pulled her back from the window. "Do not look," Clara said, her voice low and urgent. "Whatever that is, it is not our business. But curiosity is a strange animal, and it does not obey instructions well." That night, after her shift ended and the other maids had gone to sleep in their shared quarters, Mira found herself standing at the edge of the kitchen garden with a small bundle of scraps wrapped in cloth, staring at the tree line beyond the old stone wall, where the guard said something had been seen. She told herself she was only checking that it was gone. She told herself this several times, as she walked closer to the wall than any reasonable person would walk toward a place where guards had dropped their spears in fear. The night was cold, the kind of cold that turns breath into little clouds, and the moon was thin and offered barely enough light to see the path beneath her feet. That was when she heard it, a low sound, not quite a growl and not quite a whimper, coming from behind a cluster of dead bushes near the base of the wall. Every instinct told her to run back inside and lock the door behind her, and for a moment she nearly did. But something about the sound stopped her. It did not sound like a threat, it sounded like pain. She took one careful step, then another, until she could see a shape in the shadows. It was enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever heard described in the stories the older servants told to frighten children into staying indoors after dark. Its fur was the color of ash, matted in places with something dark that she suspected was blood. One of its front legs was tucked beneath its body at an angle that made her stomach turn, and its eyes, when they found hers, were a pale gold that seemed to catch what little moonlight there was and hold it. Mira should have screamed. She should have run. Instead, she found herself lowering slowly to the ground, still several feet away, and unwrapping the bundle of scraps she had brought. "I am not going to hurt you," she said quietly, feeling foolish the moment the words left her mouth, because of course a wolf could not understand her. But the animal's ears flicked toward her voice, and its golden eyes stayed fixed on her face rather than on the food, which struck her as strange even then. She set the bundle down on a flat stone about an arm's length away, and then, moving with the same slow caution she used when calming frightened kitchen animals, backed away several steps and sat down against the base of the wall to watch. The wolf did not move for a long time. It simply watched her back, its breathing labored, its wounded leg trembling faintly with each exhale. Minutes passed in silence before the animal finally dragged itself, wincing, toward the stone. It ate carefully, almost delicately, for a creature of its size, never once taking its eyes fully away from her. When it finished, it did not retreat into the darkness the way she expected. It simply lay down where it was, exhausted, and closed its eyes as though it trusted her enough to rest. Mira did not know how long she sat there in the cold, watching the rise and fall of the wolf's ribs, feeling an odd tightness in her chest that she could not name. It was well past midnight when she finally forced herself to stand, her legs stiff and aching, and whisper a promise into the dark that she had no logical reason to make. "I will come back tomorrow," she said, and somehow, impossibly, the wolf opened one golden eye, as if it had understood every word. The next day passed in a blur of chores that felt heavier than usual, her mind circling back again and again, to the image of that wounded animal watching her with such unsettling awareness. Clara noticed her distraction, and scolded her twice for burning the morning bread, but Mira barely registered the words. When evening finally came and the kitchen quieted, she wrapped another bundle of scraps, this time adding a strip of cloth she had cleaned and torn for bandages, though she doubted a wild wolf would allow her anywhere near its wounds. The wolf was waiting, in nearly the same spot, though it had dragged itself a short distance closer to where she had sat the night before. Its condition looked no better, and perhaps slightly worse, but when it saw her approaching, something in its posture shifted. It lifted its head with what looked almost like relief, and Mira felt that same tightness return to her chest, sharper this time. She repeated the ritual from the previous night, setting the food down and retreating to sit against the wall. But tonight, when the wolf had finished eating, it did not simply lie down and rest. Instead, it looked at her for a long moment, then at the cloth bandages she had brought and left folded neatly beside the stone, and made a low sound that was almost, impossibly, like recognition. Over the following days, a pattern formed itself, without either of them planning it. Mira would slip away, each night, after her work was finished, bringing food, and eventually managing, through slow and careful movements, to clean and wrap the worst of the wolf's wounds. She talked to it while she worked, the way she might talk to herself if she were alone, telling it about the exhaustion of kitchen work, the ache in her hands from scrubbing pots, the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people all day and still feeling invisible. The wolf never made a sound of protest when she touched its injured leg, even though she knew from the way its muscles tensed that it must have hurt. It simply watched her with those pale gold eyes, patient in a way that felt entirely unnatural for a wild animal, as though it understood not just her actions but her words. Word began to spread among the kitchen staff that Mira had taken to sneaking out at night, though none of them knew exactly why, and the rumors that filled the gap ranged from silly to unkind. Some said she was meeting a secret lover from the stables. Others, less kindly, said the fever that took her parents had finally reached her mind, and that she now wandered the grounds talking to shadows. Lucy, the only maid close to Mira's own age who had ever bothered to be genuinely kind to her, cornered her one evening in the narrow hallway outside the sleeping quarters. "Where do you go?" Lucy asked, her voice more concerned than accusing. "You come back smelling of dirt and cold air, and you have circles under your eyes, like you have not slept properly in weeks." Mira hesitated, weighing whether to lie, but something in Lucy's honest worry made the truth easier to offer. "There is an animal by the eastern wall," she admitted quietly. "It is hurt. I have been bringing it food." Lucy's eyes went wide, with something between fear and disbelief. "The wolf the guard saw?" she whispered. "Mira, that thing nearly took off a guard's arm before it vanished into the trees. You cannot be feeding it with your own hands. It could kill you, and no one would even know where to look." "It has not hurt me," Mira said, and she found, to her own surprise, that she believed this completely. "It has had every chance to, and it has not." Lucy did not look convinced, but she also did not report Mira to anyone in authority, for which Mira was quietly grateful. That night, as she made her way once again to the eastern wall, she found herself wondering why she felt so certain the wolf meant her no harm, when every rational piece of evidence suggested she should be terrified. The wolf was healing. She could see it in the way it now rose to greet her rather than simply lifting its head, in the way its wounded leg bore weight again, still stiff but no longer trembling with every movement. Its coat, once dull and matted with dried blood, had begun to regain some of its natural shine, revealing fur so richly colored, it almost looked silver under the moonlight. She had started bringing better food, sneaking cuts of meat from the kitchen stores when Clara was not looking, telling herself it was a small enough theft that no one would notice, and reminding herself of the guilt only briefly, before pushing it aside. The wolf ate everything she offered with the same careful, almost polite manner it always had, as though it were conscious of not startling her with its size or its teeth. One night, nearly 2 weeks into their strange arrangement, Mira arrived to find the wolf already sitting upright and waiting for her, its posture alert and expectant, in a way that made her smile despite the strangeness of the entire situation. "You look better," she said, setting down the food. "Much better. Soon you will not need me at all." The wolf tilted its head at this, an expression so distinctly thoughtful that a chill ran down her spine, quickly followed by something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to affection. She had never had a pet growing up, had never had the luxury of caring for another living creature when she could barely care for herself, and there was something deeply satisfying about watching this powerful, wild thing grow stronger because of her efforts. She began to notice small details that unsettled her in a way she could not quite explain. The wolf seemed to understand tone if not words, reacting to her sadness with a kind of stillness, to her rare moments of laughter, with an alertness that almost looked like pleasure. When she once mentioned offhand how tired she was of being overlooked by everyone in the palace, the wolf had moved, slowly and deliberately, until its large head rested against her knee, as if offering comfort it had no ordinary reason to understand she needed. Mira told herself repeatedly that she was imagining these things, that loneliness and exhaustion were making her read intention into simple animal instinct. But late at night, lying awake in her narrow bed listening to the soft breathing of the other maids around her, she found herself thinking about golden eyes that seemed to hold far too much understanding for an ordinary wolf, and she could not shake the feeling that something larger than she understood was unfolding just beyond the palace wall. By the end of that first month, the ritual had become the most important part of her day, the quiet hour she looked forward to through every tedious task in the kitchen. She no longer feared the walk to the eastern wall in the dark. She feared only the nights when illness or exhaustion kept her from going, when she lay in bed wondering if the wolf waited for her the way she waited for it, or if such thoughts were simply the foolish imaginings of a girl too starved for connection to see the situation clearly. She did not know, could not have known, that somewhere deep within the palace walls, an entire kingdom was quietly holding its breath, waiting for a king who had not been seen in public for over a year, and that the connection between his absence and the wolf at the wall was closer than anyone, including Mira herself, could possibly imagine. 2 months into her secret ritual, Mira noticed the wolf had begun to change, in ways that went beyond simple healing. It was not just that the wound on its leg had closed into a thin, pale scar, or that its coat had grown thick and glossy with proper food. It was something in the way it watched her, something that felt less like an animal observing a food source, and more like a person listening carefully to every word she said. She had taken to talking more freely with each passing night, no longer editing herself out of caution. She spoke about her parents, about the fever that had taken them so quickly she barely had time to say goodbye, about the strange guilt of surviving when they had not. She spoke about Clara's sharp tongue hiding a surprisingly soft heart, about Lucy's quiet kindness, about the ache of being surrounded by dozens of people every day, and still feeling like a shadow moving through rooms no one truly saw. The wolf listened to all of it without judgment, its golden eyes steady on her face, occasionally letting out a low sound that seemed almost like agreement. There were nights when it pressed its great head against her side, and she would rest her hand on its fur, feeling the steady rhythm of its heartbeat beneath her palm, and think that this strange friendship, however impossible it seemed, was the most honest connection she had known in years. One evening, as autumn began to turn the leaves along the eastern wall gold and red, Mira arrived later than usual, delayed by a chaotic dinner service that had left the entire kitchen staff scrambling. She was tired in a way that went beyond her body, tired in her spirit, and she sank down against the wall with less of her usual care, letting out a long breath that carried more weight than she intended. The wolf was there instantly, closer than it had ever come before, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from its body. It did not wait for her to offer food this time. It simply lay down beside her, its side pressed gently against hers, as though it understood that tonight she needed comfort more than she needed careful distance. Mira found herself crying then, quietly at first, and then with the kind of release that comes only after months of carrying something alone. She cried for her parents, for the years of loneliness in the palace, for the strange, exhausting effort of pretending to be fine when she was not. The wolf did not move away from her tears. It stayed pressed against her side, patient and warm, until the worst of it had passed, and she was left simply breathing in the cool night air, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Thank you," she whispered eventually, resting her hand against its neck. "I do not know what you are, or why you understand me the way you do, but I am grateful you are here." The wolf turned its head slightly, and for a fraction of a second, Mira could have sworn its eyes looked almost sorrowful, as though it wished it could offer her more than silent companionship, as though there were words trapped somewhere inside it that it could not find a way to speak. The moment passed quickly, and she told herself again that she was imagining things, that exhaustion and grief were playing tricks on her perception. As the weeks continued, the rest of the palace remained largely unaware of the strange bond forming at its edges, too consumed with its own quiet crisis to notice a kitchen maid slipping out after dark. The rumors about the missing king had grown louder and stranger with each passing month. Some said King Adrian was gravely ill, confined to his private chambers under the care of physicians sworn to secrecy. Others whispered darker theories, that he had been overthrown quietly and replaced by advisors pulling strings behind a closed throne room door, that the kingdom was being ruled not by its rightful sovereign, but by a council desperate to hide the truth from the public. Clara mentioned it once while kneading bread, her voice pitched low so the younger kitchen boys would not overhear. "A kingdom cannot survive forever on rumors and closed doors," she said. "Sooner or later, the people will demand to see their king with their own eyes, and heaven help this palace when that day comes." Mira had listened with only half her attention at the time, her mind still occupied with thoughts of golden eyes and warm fur, never once considering that the mystery of the missing king and the mystery of the wolf at the wall might be connected threads of the same larger secret. It seemed impossible, the kind of thought that belonged only in the fantastical stories the older servants told to frighten children, not in the practical, exhausting reality of her daily life. But strange details had begun accumulating in the back of her mind, small things she had noticed without fully processing. The wolf was never present during daylight hours, no matter how early she checked or how late she stayed. It seemed to appear only after full dark had settled over the grounds, and it always vanished before the first hint of dawn touched the sky. There were nights when it arrived limping in ways that did not match its earlier wounds, as though something entirely new had happened to it in the hours she did not see it. One particularly cold night, as she cleaned a fresh scrape along its shoulder, she noticed something that made her pause entirely. Beneath the thick fur, faint and easily missed unless she was looking closely, was a mark that resembled nothing so much as a brand, old and healed but deliberately placed, in a pattern that struck her as strangely familiar though she could not immediately place why. She traced her fingers over it gently, feeling the wolf go very still beneath her touch. "Where did this come from?" she murmured, more to herself than to the animal, but the wolf's entire body had tensed in a way that suggested the question meant something to it, something significant enough to disturb its usual calm. She let the matter drop that night, sensing she had touched on something the wolf was not ready, or perhaps not able, to reveal. But the memory of that mark stayed with her, nagging at the edges of her thoughts during the long hours of kitchen work, until one afternoon, while helping Lucy polish silverware in the servants' hall, she caught sight of the royal crest embossed on a ceremonial platter, and felt her breath catch entirely in her throat. The mark on the wolf's shoulder was the royal crest of Aldervane, worn and faded with age, but unmistakably the same symbol she had seen 100 times without truly looking, on banners, on coins, on the very silverware in her hands. Her mind reeled with the impossibility of what this might mean, and she spent the rest of her shift in a state of distracted confusion, dropping a tray of glasses that shattered across the stone floor, and earned her a sharp scolding from Clara that she barely registered. By the time evening came and she made her way once again to the eastern wall, her heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief she could not fully name. The wolf was waiting, as always, and when it saw the expression on her face, it grew unusually still, watching her with an intensity that felt almost like bracing for impact. Mira approached slowly, sitting down at her usual distance, though tonight the silence between them felt heavier, charged with unspoken questions she was not sure she had the courage to ask aloud. "I saw the crest today," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "on a platter in the servants' hall. The same mark you carry on your shoulder." The wolf did not move, did not make a sound, but something in its posture shifted, a kind of tension settling over its powerful frame that had nothing to do with fear of her, and everything to do with the weight of a secret being, slowly, carefully unearthed. Mira felt her pulse quicken as a dozen half-formed theories collided in her mind, each one more impossible than the last, and yet none of them felt quite as impossible as they should have. "Are you connected to the palace somehow?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Did someone hurt you because of who you belong to?" The wolf's golden eyes held hers for a long, unbearable moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, it lowered its great head in something that looked unmistakably like a nod. Mira's hands began to tremble, though whether from fear or the sheer overwhelming strangeness of the moment, she could not say. She had 100 more questions crowding her throat, but the wolf, as if sensing she needed time to absorb what had just been confirmed, simply moved closer and rested its head against her lap, offering the same silent comfort it always had, as though asking her not to be afraid of whatever truth still lay hidden beneath the surface. She stayed there long after the moon had climbed high overhead, her fingers moving absently through soft fur, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers, and beneath all of it, a quiet, persistent thought that refused to leave her alone. Whatever the wolf truly was, whatever secret it carried beneath that royal mark, she was no longer simply feeding a stray animal outside the palace walls. She was standing at the edge of something far larger than she understood, and there was no turning back now that she had glimpsed even this small piece of the truth. After that night, everything between Mira and the wolf felt different, though neither of them spoke of it directly, since one of them could not speak at all, and the other did not yet know how to voice the questions crowding her mind. She continued her nightly visits with the same devotion as before, but now she watched the wolf with new eyes, searching for clues in every gesture, every flicker of expression that seemed too complex for an ordinary animal. She began to notice things she had previously dismissed as coincidence. The wolf seemed to react to sounds from deep within the palace, its ears turning sharply toward the direction of the throne room whenever bells rang to announce important visitors. On nights when she mentioned overhearing gossip about the missing king, the wolf grew unusually restless, pacing in tight circles before settling again beside her, as though the topic stirred something it could not express. Winter arrived early that year, bringing sharp winds that cut through Mira's thin coat as she made her nightly journey to the eastern wall. She began bundling herself in extra layers, refusing to let the cold keep her from the one part of her day that felt genuinely her own. The wolf noticed her shivering one particularly bitter evening, and, without hesitation, pressed its large body against hers, sharing warmth in a way that felt less like animal instinct and more like a considered, caring choice. It was during this stretch of winter that Lucy began asking more pointed questions, her earlier concern sharpening into something closer to suspicion. "You have changed," Lucy said one afternoon as they sorted linens together in the laundry room. "You used to jump at every sound, and now you walk around like you are carrying some enormous secret you refuse to share. Mira, please, whatever this is, you can trust me." Mira hesitated for a long moment, torn between the relief of finally confiding in someone and the fear that speaking the truth aloud might somehow shatter the fragile, impossible thing she had found. In the end, caution won out, though she offered Lucy a partial truth. "The wolf and I have become friends," she admitted quietly. "I know it sounds foolish, but it is gentle, and it needs me, and for the first time in years I feel like I matter to something." Lucy's expression softened, though worry still lingered in her eyes. "Just be careful," she said. "Wild things are still wild, no matter how gentle they seem in the moonlight, and if the guards ever find out you have been sneaking food to that creature, there will be consequences neither of us can protect you from." The warning stayed with Mira longer than she expected, planting a seed of anxiety that grew heavier with each passing week, as the guards, still shaken by the earlier attack near the eastern gate, increased their patrols along the outer walls. She began timing her visits more carefully, learning the guards' rotation schedule through careful observation, slipping out during the narrow windows when the path to the wall was clear. One night, her careful planning nearly failed her. She had just settled beside the wolf, unwrapping a bundle of food, when the sound of approaching footsteps sent both of them into sudden stillness. A patrol had shifted its usual route, and two guards were walking directly toward their hiding spot, lanterns swinging with each step, voices carrying easily through the cold night air. Mira's heart lurched into her throat as she scrambled to gather the evidence of her presence, but there was no time to hide properly, no time to retreat back toward the kitchen without being seen crossing open ground. The wolf, sensing her panic, moved with startling speed, positioning its large body between her and the approaching light, shielding her from view within the deeper shadows cast by the wall. She pressed herself flat against the cold stone, barely daring to breathe, watching through a gap in the wolf's protective stance, as the guard's lantern light swept dangerously close to where they hid. For several agonizing seconds, she was certain they would be discovered, that the wolf would be seen as a threat and attacked on sight, that her secret nights would end not with quiet understanding, but with violence and exposure. But the guards, distracted by their own conversation about a card game one of them had lost earlier that evening, passed within a few feet of the wall without noticing anything unusual in the shadows. Their footsteps and voices faded gradually into the distance, and Mira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear. "That was too close," she whispered, once she trusted her voice not to shake. "We cannot keep doing this without a plan. If they find you, they will not ask questions first. They will attack, and I do not know if I could stop them." The wolf turned to look at her, its golden eyes holding an expression she was beginning to recognize as something close to regret, as though it understood the danger she was placing herself in for its sake, and wished desperately it could offer her a different, safer arrangement. It pressed its head gently against her hand, a gesture she had come to understand as its version of reassurance, though tonight it did little to calm the anxious pounding of her heart. Despite the growing danger, Mira found she could not bring herself to stop the visits, even as caution screamed at her to reconsider. The bond between them had grown into something she was no longer willing to walk away from, regardless of the risk. She told herself it was simple loyalty, the natural result of months spent nursing a wounded creature back to health. But late at night, staring up at the ceiling of the servants' quarters, she suspected the truth ran deeper than she was ready to admit, even to herself. As winter deepened, strange changes began appearing within the palace itself, changes that Mira, absorbed in her own secret world, was slow to notice at first. Advisors moved through the halls with tighter, more anxious expressions. Meetings behind closed doors grew longer and more frequent. A tension had settled over the entire estate, the kind that comes before a storm, though no one below the rank of senior staff seemed to know exactly what crisis was brewing. Clara, who had worked in the palace long enough to read these signs better than most, pulled Mira aside one evening with an unusually serious expression. "Something is happening with the crown," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could overhear. "There is talk of a council vote, something about questioning the king's fitness to rule given his continued absence. If they push this through, it could mean real trouble for all of us, servants included. A change in power rarely goes smoothly." Mira absorbed this information with a distracted nod, her mind already drifting back toward the eastern wall, and the wolf waiting there, and it did not occur to her, not even for a moment, to connect the palace's political turmoil with the strange, wounded creature who bore the royal crest hidden beneath its fur. It was only later that night, sitting beside the wolf as it grew unusually agitated, pacing and whining in a manner she had never witnessed before, that a cold, creeping suspicion began to take shape in her mind. "Something is wrong tonight," she observed carefully. "You are more restless than I have ever seen you. Does this have something to do with whatever is happening inside the palace?" The wolf stopped its pacing abruptly and turned to face her fully, its golden eyes intense and pleading in a way that made her chest ache with the desperate need to understand what it was trying to communicate. It moved closer, closer than it had ever come before, and pressed its head firmly against her chest, holding the position for several long seconds, as though trying to convey through touch alone what it could not say with words. Mira wrapped her arms around its thick neck instinctively, feeling the rapid, anxious beat of its heart beneath her palms. "Whatever is happening," she whispered fiercely, "I am not going anywhere. I do not fully understand what you are, or what secrets you carry, but I know you, and I trust you, and that is enough for me to stay by your side through whatever comes next." The wolf let out a low, mournful sound at these words, a sound so full of unspoken longing and gratitude that it left Mira with an unshakable certainty, deep in her bones, that whatever answers awaited her were closer than she had ever imagined, and that the truth, when it finally arrived, would change everything she thought she understood about her quiet, ordinary life within the palace walls. Inside the Grand Council chamber, far from the quiet corner of the eastern wall where Mira spent her nights, a very different scene was unfolding. A man named Edmund, senior advisor to the crown and the most vocal critic of the king's continued absence, stood before a gathering of nobles with a rolled parchment clutched tightly in one hand. His voice, when he spoke, carried the practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed his argument many times over. "The kingdom cannot continue to be led by a shadow," Edmund declared, his eyes sweeping across the assembled faces. "King Adrian has not appeared before this council in over a year. He has not addressed the people, has not signed a single decree with his own hand in months, has not been seen by anyone outside a small circle of personal attendants. I ask you, honored members of this council, how long are we expected to govern in the name of a man who may as well not exist?" A younger noble named Victor, ambitious and eager to align himself with whichever side of the argument might benefit him most, rose to add his voice in support. "My family has suffered under this uncertainty long enough," he said. "Trade agreements sit unsigned. Foreign delegations grow impatient waiting for royal audiences that never happen. If the king is unfit to rule, whether through illness or some other affliction, the kingdom deserves a regent who can act in his place, someone willing to be seen and heard by the people who depend on strong leadership." Not everyone in the chamber agreed with such drastic proposals. An older advisor named Grace, who had served the royal family since Adrian's childhood and carried an authority in her quiet steadiness that few in the room dared challenge, rose slowly to her feet. "You speak of removing a king as though it were a simple matter of paperwork," she said, her voice steady, despite the murmurs that followed her words. "I have known King Adrian since he was a boy barely able to hold a sword properly. Whatever burden he carries in private, I have faith that he carries it for reasons far greater than simple negligence. Patience has served this kingdom well in darker times than this." Grace's words carried weight, enough to delay any formal vote for the time being, but the tension in the chamber remained thick as the meeting adjourned, with Edmund and Victor exchanging a knowing glance that suggested this was far from the end of their efforts to force a change in leadership. Neither of them, nor anyone else in that chamber, understood the true nature of the affliction their king carried, a secret so carefully guarded that only a handful of trusted servants, Grace among them, knew the full and impossible truth. Grace had been present on the night, more than a year earlier, when a curse laid upon the royal bloodline generations ago had finally, catastrophically, taken full hold of the young king. She remembered the horror and confusion of that first transformation, the way Adrian's screams had turned into something no longer human halfway through the night, the desperate scramble to contain the situation before anyone outside the innermost circle could witness what had happened. The curse, according to old records Grace had spent months researching in secret, had been placed upon Adrian's ancestors centuries earlier by a wronged sorceress whose exact grievance had been lost to history, leaving only the punishment behind. Each generation, the affliction manifested differently, sometimes skipping bloodlines entirely for decades before resurfacing without warning. For Adrian, it meant involuntary, uncontrollable shifts into wolf form that could strike at any hour, lasting anywhere from several hours to, in his worst episodes, several days at a stretch. In the earliest months following his first transformation, Adrian had been kept confined entirely within a heavily guarded section of the palace, his condition hidden even from most of the household staff under the official story of a mysterious illness requiring complete isolation. But confinement had taken its own toll on him, a toll Grace had watched with growing alarm as the young king grew increasingly withdrawn, increasingly hopeless, retreating further into silence with each passing week. It had been Grace's own suggestion, made cautiously and without full confidence it would work, that perhaps allowing him supervised access to the palace grounds during his transformed periods might do more good than harm, provided proper precautions were taken to keep him away from populated areas. It was a decision she had made quietly, without the full council's knowledge, arranging for the Eastern Gate guards to be reassigned on certain nights and creating small gaps in patrol schedules that no one questioned too closely. She had not anticipated, in her careful planning, that a lonely kitchen maid would stumble upon the king during one of his most vulnerable moments and, through nothing more than simple kindness, begin a friendship that seemed to be doing more to heal Adrian's spirit than a year of careful, clinical management ever had. Grace had learned of Mira's nightly visits within the first few weeks, informed by a guard who had noticed unusual patterns near the eastern wall, but had been sworn, under Grace's careful instruction, to keep the observations strictly confidential. She had watched from a discreet distance on several occasions, uncertain whether to intervene, torn between protecting the kitchen maid from a dangerous secret and protecting her king from further isolation. In the end, she had chosen to do nothing, watching with quiet, cautious hope as Adrian's transformed self grew calmer, more patient, more willing to endure his condition, with something approaching peace rather than despair, all because of the presence of a young woman who had no idea she was tending to her own king. But now, with Edmund and Victor growing bolder in their push to remove Adrian from power, Grace understood that time was running short. The council could not be held off indefinitely by appeals to patience and loyalty. Sooner or later, either Adrian would need to find a way to control his affliction well enough to reclaim his public duties, or the throne would be lost to men who cared far more about ambition than the well-being of the kingdom they claimed to serve. That evening, Grace made her way to the private wing of the palace, where Adrian spent his human hours, finding him seated near a cold hearth, his expression distant and troubled in the way it so often was these days. She had known him since he was a boy learning to hold a practice sword, had watched him grow into a thoughtful, if reserved, young man who took his responsibilities to the kingdom seriously despite his youth, and it pained her deeply to see how thoroughly the curse had worn down his spirit. "The council grows restless," she told him gently, settling into the chair across from his. "Edmund and Victor will not wait forever for an excuse to move against you. If we do not find some way forward soon, I fear we may lose more than just political ground." Adrian's jaw tightened, though his eyes remained fixed on the cold hearth rather than meeting her gaze. "What would you have me do, Grace?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I cannot control when the change comes. I cannot promise the council a king who will not vanish into the woods without warning, in the middle of an important negotiation. Every solution you propose still requires a version of myself I no longer have full command over." Grace considered her next words carefully, before speaking them aloud. "There is someone," she said slowly, "who has been visiting you during your transformed hours. A kitchen maid, by all reports gentle and devoted, who has been tending to you these many months, without any knowledge of who you truly are." For the first time since she had entered the room, Adrian's full attention snapped toward her, something flickering behind his tired eyes that Grace had not seen in a very long time. Hope, perhaps, or something dangerously close to it. "I have noticed," he admitted quietly, his voice softer now. "Even in my other form, I remember these nights more clearly than I remember most things during that time. Her voice, her kindness, the way she talks to me as though I am still worth listening to. I have wondered, more than once, whether meeting her properly might be worth the risk of revealing everything." Grace studied him carefully, weighing the enormous complications such a revelation might create, both for Adrian personally, and for the fragile political situation surrounding the throne. And yet, watching the first genuine spark of interest cross his face, in longer than she could remember, she found herself unable to argue against the idea entirely. "Perhaps," she said finally, "it is time you considered exactly that." The storm arrived without warning, on a night that had begun calmly enough, the sky clear and star-scattered, when Mira first slipped out toward the eastern wall, carrying her usual bundle of food. Within an hour, dark clouds had rolled in with alarming speed, swallowing the stars whole, and by the time she reached her usual spot beside the wall, the first fat drops of rain had already begun to fall. The wolf was waiting for her, as always, but something in the charged, electric quality of the air seemed to make it unusually alert, its ears swiveling toward the distant rumble of thunder that followed close behind the first flashes of lightning. Mira barely had time to set down the food before the storm broke fully, rain falling in heavy, punishing sheets that soaked through her thin coat within moments. She turned to hurry back toward the shelter of the kitchen, calling a hasty goodbye over her shoulder, but her foot caught on a slick patch of stone hidden beneath the sudden flood of rainwater, and she went down hard, her ankle twisting painfully beneath her as pain shot up her leg. She cried out, more from shock than the full extent of the injury, and found herself unable to put weight on the ankle when she tried to rise. The wolf was at her side almost instantly, its large body providing some shelter from the worst of the driving rain, as it nudged at her gently, clearly trying to help her rise. When she attempted to stand and immediately collapsed again with a sharp gasp of pain, the wolf's demeanor shifted into something more purposeful, more decisive, as though it had made a sudden and important decision about what needed to happen next. It positioned itself against her side and, with surprising gentleness for a creature of its size, began guiding her, step by careful step, away from the open ground and toward a small stone alcove built into the palace wall that Mira had never noticed before, tucked away behind an overgrown hedge that mostly hid it from casual view. It was clearly an old structure, perhaps once used for storage or as a guard's shelter during long watches, now mostly forgotten and reclaimed by ivy and dust. Inside, the alcove provided welcome protection from the worst of the storm, though the wind still howled outside and the temperature had dropped sharply with the rain. Mira sank down against the far wall, her ankle throbbing with each heartbeat, and found herself shivering uncontrollably as her soaked clothes clung to her cold skin. The wolf settled beside her without hesitation, pressing its warm, thick body directly against hers, sharing heat in a way that gradually began to ease the worst of her shivering. "Thank you," she whispered through chattering teeth, resting her head against its shoulder as exhaustion and cold combined to make her limbs feel impossibly heavy. "I do not know what I would have done out there without you." The wolf made a low, comforting sound in response, shifting slightly to better shield her from the draft that crept in around the alcove's entrance. As the storm raged on outside, its fury showing no signs of weakening, Mira found her eyelids growing heavier despite the pain still radiating from her injured ankle. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and the steady, reassuring warmth beside her, pulling her gradually toward sleep. "I should stay awake," she murmured, more to herself than to her companion. But even as she spoke the words, her body was already betraying her, sinking further into the warmth beside her, her hand coming to rest instinctively against the thick fur of the wolf's side. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her fully was the steady, rhythmic beat of its heart beneath her palm, strangely soothing despite everything strange and impossible about her current situation. She woke slowly, disoriented, aware first of the fact that the storm had passed, leaving behind only the soft, dripping quiet of an early morning after heavy rain. Sunlight filtered weakly through the alcove's entrance, and for a moment, Mira simply lay still, trying to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. It was only when she moved to sit up, wincing at the dull ache still present in her ankle, that she realized the wolf was gone, and in its place, draped carefully over her shoulders, was a heavy cloak of fine dark fabric, far too well made to belong to any ordinary member of the household staff. She stared at it for a long moment, her sleep-addled mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing, before a slow, creeping realization began to settle over her, cold and undeniable despite the warmth of the cloak. She examined the fabric more closely, noting the quality of the stitching, the subtle embroidery along the collar that matched, unmistakably, the same royal crest she had seen on the wolf's shoulder weeks earlier, and on the silverware in the servants' hall. Her hands trembled slightly as the pieces she had been avoiding, fully assembling in her mind, finally clicked together, into a shape too enormous and impossible to easily accept. She did not speak of the cloak to anyone when she finally made her way back to the kitchen, limping slightly on her sore ankle, and offering only a vague excuse about slipping on wet stone during her early morning walk. She hid the cloak beneath her thin mattress that night, unable to bring herself to discard it or explain its presence, and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through possibilities that felt too fantastical to be real, and yet fit together too perfectly to be dismissed as coincidence. Over the following days, Mira found herself unable to focus properly on her usual duties, distracted by a swirl of questions she had no safe way to voice aloud. She began, cautiously and without drawing obvious attention to her intentions, asking quiet questions of the older kitchen staff about old legends, about curses said to run through certain noble bloodlines, about any stories they might have heard growing up regarding shapeshifters bound by ancient magic to particular families or crowns. Most of the staff dismissed her questions as idle curiosity, or brushed them off as superstitious nonsense unworthy of serious discussion. But one elderly groundskeeper named Henry, who had worked at the palace for over 4 decades and remembered stories from his own grandmother's time, offered a response that made the hair on Mira's arms stand on end. "There is an old tale," he said slowly, settling onto an overturned crate as he took a break from his work, "about a sorceress wronged by an ancestor of the current royal line, generations and generations back. The story goes that she cursed the bloodline to walk as beasts under the moon, unable to control the change, doomed to carry the affliction until the line either died out or found some way to break the curse's hold. My grandmother always said it was just a story meant to frighten children, but I have heard enough whispers over the years about a mysterious royal illness to wonder sometimes if there might be more truth to the old tale than anyone in this palace is willing to admit out loud." Mira thanked him and walked away in a daze, her heart pounding with the weight of confirmation she had not fully expected to receive. If the old legend was true, if the curse Henry described matched what she had witnessed with her own eyes over the past several months, then the wolf she had been feeding, the wolf she had grown to trust and care for so deeply, was not simply an animal at all. It was, impossibly, Unbelievably, the missing King Adrian himself. The realization sat heavily in her chest for the rest of that day, and long into the night that followed. A tangled mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else entirely. Something warmer, and more frightening than either of those emotions, that she was not yet ready to examine too closely. She thought of every conversation she had ever had beside the eastern wall. Every secret she had confided to Golden Eyes, she now understood belonged to her own king, and felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with a strange, aching tenderness that she could not fully untangle. She did not know what to do with this knowledge, whether to confront the truth directly or continue pretending, for the wolf's sake, and perhaps for her own, that nothing had changed between them. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the cloak still hidden beneath her mattress, she understood with growing certainty that whatever came next, there was no possible way to return fully to the simple, uncomplicated friendship she had believed herself to be part of for the better part of a year. 2 days passed before Mira found the courage to return to the eastern wall, uncertain what she would say, or how she would act, now that the impossible truth sat so heavily between them. She half expected the wolf, or rather, she reminded herself with a strange lurch in her stomach, the king, to somehow sense her newfound knowledge and react with distance or discomfort. But when she arrived that evening, he was waiting exactly as he always had, his golden eyes finding hers with the same quiet warmth as every night before. She sat down at her usual spot, her hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped the food she had brought, unsure how to begin voicing everything churning inside her. The wolf watched her closely, clearly sensing that something had shifted in her demeanor, and after a long moment of silence, he moved closer than usual, resting his head gently against her knee, in a gesture that had become familiar over their months together. "I know who you are," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, though it felt enormous in the quiet of the night. "Or at least, I think I know. The crest, the cloak you left me during the storm, the old stories about a curse on the royal bloodline. It all fits together in a way I cannot ignore anymore, no matter how impossible it seems." The wolf went very still at her words, his golden eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the trees beyond the wall. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head in the same unmistakable nod he had offered weeks earlier, when she first asked about the royal mark on his shoulder. Mira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she could not have said exactly why, whether from relief at having her suspicions confirmed, or from the overwhelming complexity of everything this confirmation now meant. "You are King Adrian," she said softly, testing the words aloud as though saying them might make the truth easier to fully accept. "The king everyone in the palace has been whispering about for over a year. The king I have been talking to, and crying in front of, and falling asleep beside without having any idea." The wolf made a low, mournful sound at this, pressing closer against her, as though trying to offer comfort, despite being unable to explain himself with words. Mira wrapped her arms around his neck instinctively, the familiar gesture grounding her amid the dizzying whirl of realization still settling over her thoughts. "I am not afraid," she said firmly, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "I do not fully understand how any of this is possible, or what it means for either of us going forward, but I am not afraid of you, and nothing about what I have learned changes how I feel about the friendship we have built these past months." The following evening, an unexpected summons arrived at the kitchen, delivered by a stern-faced attendant who informed Mira, to the shock and confusion of every other member of the kitchen staff, that she was to report immediately to the private wing of the palace reserved for the royal family and their closest advisors. Clara nearly dropped an entire tray of dishes at the announcement, and Lucy's eyes went wide with a mixture of alarm and curiosity as Mira, her heart pounding, followed the attendant through unfamiliar hallways she had never before been permitted to enter. She was led eventually to a private chamber, richly furnished but understated in a way that suggested careful, deliberate taste rather than mere extravagance, and left alone briefly with instructions to wait. Mira stood nervously near the center of the room, smoothing her simple kitchen uniform self-consciously, uncertain what to expect, and increasingly anxious that she had somehow been discovered and was about to face serious consequences for her many months of secret nighttime visits. When the door opened again, a man entered whose presence immediately commanded the room, though his expression carried none of the cold authority she might have expected from a king. He was perhaps a few years older than herself, with dark hair, and the same striking golden eyes she had come to know so intimately over the past year, though now set within an entirely human face, marked by faint shadows of exhaustion, and, unmistakably, a familiar scar, tracing just above his left eye. Mira's breath caught fully in her throat, as recognition crashed over her with undeniable force. It was him, the wolf, the king, standing before her now in human form, watching her with an expression of careful, hopeful uncertainty that mirrored, she realized with a start, the same expression she had grown so used to seeing in his golden animal eyes. "Your Majesty," she managed finally, dropping into an awkward, hurried curtsy that felt entirely insufficient for the enormity of the moment, her mind still struggling to reconcile the powerful wolf she had spent countless nights beside with the quiet, almost hesitant man now standing before her. "Please," he said quickly, his voice gentle, in a way that immediately eased some of her overwhelming nervousness. "There is no need for such formality between us, not after everything we have shared this past year. My name is Adrian, and I owe you an explanation, and likely an apology as well, for the deception you have unknowingly been living within on my behalf." He gestured for her to sit, and haltingly, with occasional pauses to gather his composure, he explained everything: the ancient curse laid upon his bloodline generations earlier, the uncontrollable transformations that had begun over a year ago and left him unable to fulfill his royal duties, the desperate secrecy surrounding his condition to protect both himself and the stability of the kingdom, and finally, the profound, unexpected gift of her kindness during his transformed hours, a kindness that had done more to sustain his spirit through the loneliest, most frightening period of his life than any medicine or careful management devised by his advisors. "You have no idea what your presence meant to me during those nights," he said, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to fully hide. "I was drowning in isolation and fear, convinced I would spend the rest of my life as nothing more than a beast hidden away from the world, ashamed of what I had become. And then you appeared, sitting beside me in the dark, talking to me as though I still mattered, as though I was still worth listening to despite everything. You gave me a reason to hope, Mira, more than you could possibly know." Mira sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of everything he had shared, her heart aching with a complicated mixture of sympathy, wonder, and something else entirely that she was only beginning to allow herself to acknowledge. "I had no idea," she said finally, her voice soft. "I only knew that you needed help, and that being near you felt right in a way I could not fully explain. I never imagined the truth would be anything close to this." Adrian's expression grew more serious then, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features that seemed at odds with the composed authority he otherwise carried. "There is more I must tell you," he said carefully. "The council grows restless with my continued absence from public duties. Some among them seek to use my condition as justification to remove me from the throne entirely. I do not yet know how this will unfold, but I wanted you to understand the full truth before matters grow more complicated, because whatever happens next, I did not want you to face it without knowing exactly who and what you have been so faithfully caring for this past year." Mira felt a chill of apprehension settle over her at these words, sensing, even without fully understanding the political complexities Adrian described, that the quiet, simple friendship she had built beside the Eastern Wall was about to be tested by forces far larger and more dangerous than either of them could easily control. In the weeks that followed her revealing meeting with Adrian, Mira found herself living a strange double life, continuing her ordinary duties in the kitchen during daylight hours, while being quietly summoned, several evenings each week, to the private wing, where Adrian now spent increasing amounts of time in his human form, working carefully with Grace and a small circle of trusted physicians to better understand and, if possible, learn to influence the timing of his transformations. Progress came slowly and unevenly. Some nights, Adrian would remain human for hours longer than expected, engaged in quiet conversation with Mira about topics far removed from the pressures of the crown, discussing books he had read as a boy, favorite foods from his childhood, small observations about the natural world that revealed a thoughtful, curious mind beneath his royal responsibilities. Other nights, the change would strike without warning, sometimes mid-sentence. leaving Mira sitting beside a wolf once again, where moments earlier a man had been speaking. Rather than finding these sudden shifts frightening, Mira discovered she had grown entirely comfortable moving between both versions of him, understanding by now that whether wolf or man, the person she had come to care for remained fundamentally the same, patient and thoughtful, and quietly grateful for her continued presence through every stage of his difficult, uncertain journey toward control. Grace observed their growing closeness with a mixture of relief and cautious concern, understanding better than anyone the political complications that would inevitably arise once Mira's role in Adrian's recovery became more widely known. She pulled Mira aside one evening after a particularly long session, her expression serious in a way that immediately put Mira on alert. "You must understand," Grace said carefully, "that what is developing between you and the king carries significant risk, not only for you personally but for the stability of the entire kingdom. There are members of the council who will use any excuse, however small, to challenge Adrian's fitness to rule, and a romantic attachment to a kitchen servant, however genuine and however much good it has clearly done him, will provide exactly the kind of scandal his enemies are hoping to exploit." Mira absorbed this warning with a heavy heart, understanding the wisdom behind Grace's caution, even as it filled her with a dull, aching dread. "I never intended for any of this to become complicated," she said honestly. "I only wanted to help a wounded animal, and somehow that simple kindness grew into something I no longer know how to untangle from my own heart." Grace's expression softened slightly at this admission. "I do not fault you for what has grown between you," she said more gently. "In truth, I have watched Adrian's spirit heal more in these past months than in the entire year before you entered his life. But healing his heart and securing his throne are, unfortunately, two very different challenges, and I fear we may need to navigate both very carefully in the difficult days ahead." That difficult day arrived sooner than any of them anticipated. Word had somehow reached Edmund and Victor regarding Adrian's private visits with a kitchen maid, the information likely leaked by a servant eager for favor or coin, and the two advisors wasted no time weaponizing the discovery. Within days, whispers had spread throughout the entire palace regarding the king's secret relationship with a common servant, the rumors growing more exaggerated and scandalous with each retelling, until they bore only passing resemblance to the truth. Clara approached Mira one morning with an expression of stunned disbelief, pulling her into a quiet corner of the kitchen away from curious ears. "Is it true," she asked directly, "that you have been meeting privately with the king himself all these months? The entire palace is buzzing with the story, and half of it sounds too fantastical to believe. Yet here you stand, looking as though you have been caught in exactly the kind of secret everyone suspects." Mira, unable and unwilling to continue hiding the truth from the woman who had shown her nothing but gruff, protective kindness over the years, finally shared the full story, watching Clara's expression shift from disbelief to astonishment, and finally to something like cautious, worried support. "Whatever happens, girl," Clara said finally, gripping Mira's shoulders firmly, "you hold your head up. You did nothing wrong by showing kindness to a creature in need, royal or otherwise. Let those who would judge you for it choke on their own hypocrisy." But not everyone within the palace shared Clara's supportive perspective. Edmund seized upon the scandal with obvious relish, calling an emergency session of the council to address what he framed as a grave threat to the dignity and stability of the crown. Mira, summoned once again to appear before officials, this time in a far less private and far more threatening context, found herself standing nervously outside the Grand Council chamber, her heart pounding as she awaited the judgment of powerful men who held her fate, and perhaps Adrian's as well, entirely in their hands. Inside the chamber, Edmund's voice rose with practiced indignation as he addressed the assembled nobles. "We now have confirmation," he declared, "that our missing king has spent the better part of a year engaged in secret meetings with a lowly kitchen servant, meetings conducted under circumstances so bizarre and inappropriate that I hesitate to fully describe them before this esteemed assembly. This is not the behavior of a stable, fit ruler. This is the behavior of a man whose judgment has been thoroughly compromised, whether by his mysterious illness or by improper influence from those seeking to exploit his weakened condition for personal gain." Victor added his own pointed remarks, questioning aloud whether such an inappropriate attachment suggested the girl herself might be manipulating the vulnerable king for her own advancement, a suggestion that made Mira's blood run cold with fury, and hurt in equal measure, knowing how thoroughly it distorted the genuine, uncomplicated affection she had always felt for Adrian, long before she ever knew his true identity. Grace rose to defend both Mira and Adrian with fierce, measured eloquence, reminding the council of Adrian's improved condition since Mira's involvement began, of the genuine kindness and loyalty the young woman had demonstrated, with no knowledge of any reward or advancement to be gained from her actions. But her words, however persuasive, could not entirely quiet the growing murmur of concern spreading through the chamber, fueled by Edmund and Victor's carefully calculated accusations. It was then that the chamber doors opened once more, and Adrian himself entered, his expression calm but resolute, despite the obvious tension crackling through the room. Every noble present fell into startled silence at the sight of their long-absent king standing before them, and Mira, still waiting anxiously at the edge of the gathering, felt her heart swell with a complicated mixture of pride and fear as he began to speak. "I understand this council has concerns about my fitness to rule," Adrian said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. "I understand the frustration and uncertainty my prolonged absence has caused, and I do not fault any of you for questioning circumstances that have, admittedly, been shrouded in far too much secrecy for far too long. But I will not stand here and allow the woman who has shown me more genuine compassion and loyalty than anyone else in this entire palace to be slandered and dismissed simply because the truth of my condition is difficult for some among you to accept." The chamber remained utterly silent as Adrian continued, his voice growing steadier and more resolute with each word, and Mira, watching from the edge of the room, understood with a fierce swell of emotion that whatever the council ultimately decided, he had chosen, in this critical moment, to stand openly and unashamedly at her side, rather than hide behind the safety of denial or distance. "What I am about to share with this council has been kept secret for over a year," Adrian continued, his gaze steady as he looked out across the assembled nobles. "And I do so now, not because I believe every one of you deserves the full truth, but because continued secrecy has caused far more harm than the truth itself ever could. I carry an affliction passed down through my bloodline, an ancient curse that causes me, without warning or control, to transform into the shape of a wolf. This is the illness that has kept me from your council chambers, from public duties, from the ordinary business of ruling this kingdom as I once did without difficulty." A wave of stunned murmurs swept through the chamber, disbelief and shock evident on nearly every face, though Grace, watching from her seat, noted with quiet relief that shock, at least, was preferable to the outright dismissal she had feared. Adrian pressed on, before the murmuring could grow into full chaos, his voice firm and unwavering. "During the long, difficult months of learning to live with this condition, I existed largely in isolation, frightened and increasingly hopeless about what my future, and the future of this kingdom under my rule, might hold. It was during this darkest period that Mira, working in ignorance of my true identity, began showing kindness to a wounded wolf outside the palace walls, never once suspecting the creature she cared for so faithfully was her own king. Her devotion, offered with absolutely no expectation of reward or recognition, has done more to restore my strength and my hope than any physician or advisor managed to accomplish in all the months before her involvement." He turned then, his gaze finding Mira across the chamber, and something in his expression softened, even as his voice remained steady and clear, for the benefit of the assembled council. "I will not apologize for the bond that has grown between us, nor will I allow baseless accusations of manipulation or impropriety to tarnish what has been, in truth, the single most honest and uncomplicated relationship I have known throughout my entire life as king. If this council wishes to judge my fitness to rule, let it judge me on the merits of my actions and decisions, not on cruel rumors spread by those with their own ambitions to gain from my downfall." Edmund, his earlier confidence visibly shaken by the unexpected revelation, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Your Majesty," he said, his tone carefully measured despite the obvious tension in his posture, "this council does not doubt the sincerity of your feelings, but surely you must recognize the enormous complications such a curse presents for the future stability of this kingdom. How can we in good conscience support a ruler whose very body remains outside his own control?" It was Grace who answered, before Adrian could respond, rising once more to address the chamber with the quiet authority of decades spent in royal service. "This council has weathered far greater uncertainties, than a curse that has, by all accounts, grown increasingly manageable in recent months, she said firmly. King Adrian's judgment, his compassion, and his dedication to this kingdom have not wavered, despite his affliction. If anything, the strength of character he has shown in confronting this burden, and in standing openly before this council today, rather than continuing to hide, speaks far more strongly to his fitness to rule than any argument Edmund or Victor might offer to the contrary. The chamber fell into a tense, uncertain silence, as the assembled nobles weighed Grace's words against the shock of everything they had just learned. Victor, sensing the tide of opinion beginning to shift away from his and Edmund's carefully constructed narrative, made one final attempt to salvage their position. "Even if we accept this explanation," he said, his voice edged with barely concealed frustration, "surely this council cannot condone a king openly pursuing a relationship with a common kitchen servant. Such a match would set a dangerous precedent, undermine the dignity of the crown, and invite ridicule from neighboring kingdoms who already question our stability." Adrian's expression hardened at this, though his voice remained carefully controlled. "I would remind this council," he said, "that the dignity of the crown has never once been threatened by genuine kindness or loyalty, regardless of the social standing of the person who offers it. It has, however, been repeatedly threatened by the ambition and self-interest of those who claim to serve the kingdom, while secretly working only to advance their own positions. I trust this council understands the distinction clearly enough." The pointed remark landed with visible effect, several nobles exchanging uncomfortable glances as the implications settled fully into the room. Mira, watching the entire exchange unfold, with her heart still pounding painfully against her ribs, felt a fierce, protective gratitude toward Adrian for refusing to bend beneath the pressure of Edmund and Victor's calculated maneuvering, even as she remained deeply uncertain how the council would ultimately decide to proceed. In the end, no formal vote was taken that day, the council instead adjourning in a state of uneasy, unresolved tension, with Edmund and Victor retreating to regroup their strategy, while Grace and Adrian's other supporters worked quickly to shore up loyalty among the more moderate nobles present. But the immediate crisis, at least, had been weathered without an outright loss of Adrian's position, and Mira left the chamber that day with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering anxiety about what challenges might still lie ahead. Adrian found her later that evening in a quiet garden courtyard, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the entire day fighting battles far more exhausting than physical combat. "I am sorry you were forced to witness that," he said quietly, settling beside her on a stone bench. "This is not the world I ever wished to draw you into." Mira shook her head firmly. "You stood up for me today, in front of the entire council, knowing full well what it might cost you politically," she said. "I do not regret a single moment of the year that led us here, Adrian, curse and complications included. If anything, watching you refuse to hide from the truth today only deepened my respect for the man I have come to know these past months, in whatever form that man happened to take." Adrian reached over slowly and took her hand in his, a simple gesture that carried enormous weight, given everything they had both endured to reach this fragile, uncertain moment of open honesty between them. "Whatever comes next," he said softly, "I want to face it with you beside me, not as a secret hidden behind palace walls, but openly, as whatever this has become between us deserves to be treated." In the days following the council session, an uneasy peace settled over the palace, though it was clear to everyone involved that the matter remained far from fully resolved. Edmund and Victor, though temporarily checked in their efforts to unseat Adrian, had not abandoned their ambitions entirely, and Grace warned repeatedly that men so thoroughly invested in gaining power rarely surrendered their goals after a single setback. Their next move came swiftly and with calculated cruelty. Rather than continuing to attack Adrian's fitness to rule directly, a strategy that had already backfired once, they shifted their focus toward Mira herself, spreading rumors throughout the palace and eventually into the wider village beyond its walls, suggesting that she had used manipulative charm or even forbidden magic to ensnare an already weakened king for her own selfish gain. The rumors grew uglier with each retelling, some claiming she had deliberately sought out the wounded wolf knowing his true identity from the very beginning, others suggesting darker, more sinister motives entirely, painting her as a calculating opportunist rather than the genuinely compassionate young woman everyone who actually knew her understood her to be. Mira found herself facing cold stares and whispered accusations even from staff members who had known her for years, the sting of such betrayal cutting deeper than she had expected. Lucy remained fiercely loyal throughout this difficult period, defending Mira openly against the worst of the gossip, but even her steadfast support could not fully shield Mira from the exhausting weight of constant suspicion and judgment. Clara, too, refused to entertain a single word of the rumors, sharply silencing any kitchen staff who dared repeat the ugly accusations within her hearing. But the damage to Mira's peace of mind had already been done, leaving her increasingly withdrawn and anxious as the days passed. Adrian, learning of the extent of the rumors circulating against her, grew visibly troubled, torn between his desire to publicly defend her honor and his awareness that any overly forceful response might only fuel further speculation and controversy. It was Grace who ultimately proposed the boldest solution, one that would require enormous courage from both Adrian and Mira, but that offered, perhaps, the only true path towards silencing the accusations once and for all. "You cannot continue hiding the true nature of your condition from the wider public indefinitely," Grace told Adrian during a private meeting, her tone urgent and direct. "The rumors will only worsen the longer this remains shrouded in secrecy and half-truths. I believe the time has come to address the kingdom directly and completely, to show them not just the man you are, but the full truth of what you carry, curse and all, and to let them witness for themselves the genuine character of the woman who has stood so faithfully by your side throughout your darkest struggles." The proposal terrified Mira when Adrian first shared it with her that evening. The idea of standing before the entire kingdom, facing not just curious nobles, but the judgment of ordinary citizens who had likely heard every ugly rumor circulating about her character, filling her with a dread she found difficult to fully articulate. "What if they refuse to accept the truth?" she asked quietly. "What if seeing you transform with their own eyes only confirms their worst fears rather than easing them?" Adrian took her hands gently in his own, his expression steady despite the obvious weight of uncertainty pressing down on both of them. "I cannot promise how the kingdom will respond," he admitted honestly, "but I have spent over a year hiding from the truth, allowing fear and secrecy to dictate the terms of my own life, and I have watched that same secrecy nearly cost me my throne, and very nearly cost you your reputation and safety as well. I would rather face whatever judgment comes from complete honesty than continue living under the constant threat of half-truths and manipulation from men like Edmund and Victor." The date was set for a public gathering in the grand courtyard before the palace, an event unlike anything the kingdom had witnessed in generations, where the long-absent king would finally address his people directly regarding the mysterious illness that had kept him from public view for over a year. Word spread rapidly through the village and surrounding countryside, drawing curious crowds eager to finally lay eyes on their elusive ruler after so many months of speculation and rumor. On the morning of the gathering, Mira dressed with trembling hands in a simple but dignified gown provided by Grace, her stomach twisted with nerves as she prepared to stand publicly beside Adrian for the very first time. Lucy helped arrange her hair with gentle, reassuring words, while Clara, uncharacteristically emotional, pressed a small token into her palm before she departed, an old wooden charm that Clara claimed had brought her own family good fortune for generations. "Whatever happens today, girl," Clara said gruffly, blinking back tears she clearly had not expected to shed, "you walk out there knowing you have done nothing but show genuine kindness to a creature in need. Let the whole kingdom judge you on that truth, and let anyone who still doubts your character answer to me directly." The courtyard was packed with an enormous crowd by the time Mira made her way toward the raised platform, where Adrian already stood waiting, his expression carrying a calm resolve that steadied her own racing nerves as their eyes met across the assembled masses. Edmund and Victor stood among the gathered nobles near the front of the crowd, their expressions carefully neutral, though Mira could sense the tension radiating from them, aware that today's events would likely determine the final outcome of their long campaign against Adrian's rule. Adrian raised his hand for silence as he began to address the enormous crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard through the practiced projection of a man well-trained in public speaking, despite his long absence from such duties. "My people," he began, "I have kept a truth from you for far too long, out of fear and shame regarding a condition I did not choose and cannot fully control. I stand before you today to finally share that truth completely, and to ask for your understanding, even as I demonstrate something that may, at first, appear frightening or difficult to accept. A tense silence fell over the crowd as Adrian continued his explanation, describing the ancient curse upon his bloodline with the same careful honesty he had offered the council weeks earlier. Mira watched the faces in the crowd shift through confusion, disbelief, and murmuring concern as the full weight of his words settled over the assembled masses, her heart pounding with anxious anticipation of what was still to come. "And now," Adrian said finally, his voice steady despite the obvious vulnerability of the moment, "I will show you directly, rather than ask you to simply take my word alone." A ripple of nervous energy swept through the crowd as Adrian closed his eyes, his body beginning to tremble with the familiar signs Mira had come to recognize over the countless nights she had witnessed his transformation in private. Gasps and startled cries rose from the gathered masses as his human form began to shift, bones and muscle rearranging themselves with a speed that still, even after all her months of familiarity, struck Mira as something between painful and miraculous to witness. Within moments, where a king had stood moments before, a massive gray wolf now stood upon the platform, his golden eyes sweeping calmly across the stunned, murmuring crowd. Several people near the front stumbled backward in alarm, and Mira heard scattered cries of fear ripple through the courtyard, her heart clenching with anxious uncertainty about how this pivotal moment might ultimately unfold. But rather than remaining frozen at a careful distance, the way fear and instinct might have suggested, Mira stepped forward without hesitation, closing the space between herself and the transformed king, until she stood directly beside him, her hand resting confidently against his thick fur, exactly as it had 100 times before, during their private nighttime visits. The crowd fell into a stunned, watchful silence at this unexpected display of complete comfort and trust. "This is the same king who has ruled you with wisdom and compassion," Mira called out, her voice trembling slightly, but carrying clearly across the hushed courtyard. "I have sat beside him through storms and through his darkest, most frightened nights, and I have never once known him to be anything other than gentle, thoughtful, and deeply devoted to the well-being of this kingdom he loves. Whatever shape his body takes, his heart and his character remain unchanged." A long, tense moment passed as the crowd absorbed this display, and then, slowly, an elderly woman near the front of the gathering began to clap, her weathered hands coming together in a slow, deliberate rhythm that gradually spread outward through the crowd, as others, moved by Mira's unwavering courage and the obvious gentle nature of the transformed king standing calmly beside her, began to join in. What had begun as a wave of fearful uncertainty transformed gradually into something closer to cautious acceptance, and finally, into genuine, swelling applause that echoed across the entire courtyard. Edmund and Victor, watching this dramatic shift in public sentiment with visible dismay, exchanged a final, defeated glance, understanding that whatever remaining hope they had held for turning the council and the public against Adrian had crumbled entirely in the face of his courageous honesty and Mira's unshakable, public display of loyalty and trust. As the applause continued to swell, Adrian began his transformation back into human form, the change happening more smoothly and quickly than it ever had during his earlier months of struggle, as though the sheer relief and support radiating from the crowd had somehow eased the burden his body carried. When he stood once more as a man, breathing hard but smiling with genuine, unguarded relief, he reached immediately for Mira's hand, holding it firmly before the entire watching kingdom. "This woman," he announced, his voice carrying clear and strong across the courtyard, "has shown me more genuine compassion, loyalty, and courage than I have witnessed from nearly anyone else in my entire life, curse or no curse. I do not know what shape my future holds, whether I will ever fully master control over this ancient affliction, but I know with absolute certainty that I wish to face whatever comes with her standing openly beside me, not hidden away in secrecy and shame." The crowd's response was overwhelming, cheers and applause rising up in a wave of acceptance that neither Mira nor Adrian had dared to fully hope for, given the enormous risk of the day's revelation. In the weeks and months that followed, the kingdom gradually adjusted to the truth of their king's condition, and rather than the widespread rejection Edmund and Victor had hoped to provoke, most citizens found themselves moved by the story of loyalty and compassion that had unfolded at the Eastern Palace wall, a story that spread through the countryside as a tale of hope rather than scandal. Edmund and Victor's influence within the council diminished significantly in the aftermath, their earlier manipulative tactics now viewed with widespread suspicion by nobles who had witnessed firsthand the courage and honesty Adrian had displayed, in contrast to their calculated scheming. Grace, watching the transformation of public opinion with quiet satisfaction, found herself finally able to relax after months of careful, anxious management of Adrian's fragile political position. Mira, once the invisible kitchen maid whom no one in the palace had ever bothered to truly notice, found her life utterly transformed in the months that followed, though she remained, at her core, the same thoughtful, compassionate young woman who had once knelt beside a wounded stranger in the dark, simply because something in her heart told her it was the right thing to do. Clara continued to fuss over her with gruff affection whenever she visited the kitchens, and Lucy remained her closest and most loyal friend, delighted beyond words at how thoroughly circumstances had rewarded Mira's quiet, steadfast kindness. As for Adrian, though the curse itself remained an ongoing part of his life, requiring careful management and continued patience from everyone around him, he found that the fear and isolation which had once defined his relationship with his condition had given way gradually to something closer to acceptance, even a strange kind of peace, knowing that he no longer needed to face those difficult transformed hours alone in the shadows. On quiet evenings, long after the drama of the public revelation had settled into the comfortable rhythm of their new life together, Mira and Adrian could still be found near the eastern wall, where their unlikely friendship had first begun. Sometimes as a man and woman sharing quiet conversation beneath the stars, sometimes as a woman and wolf resting together in comfortable silence, the exact same bond that had sustained them both through the darkest year of Adrian's life, continuing to anchor them steadily through whatever challenges still lay ahead. The kingdom of Aldervane, in time, came to tell the story not as a scandal whispered behind closed doors, but as a celebrated tale of loyalty triumphing over fear, passed down through generations, as proof that true kindness, offered without expectation of reward, has the power to heal even the deepest and most impossible wounds, and that sometimes the most powerful bonds are formed not despite our differences, but in the quiet, patient spaces where genuine hearts finally recognize one another for exactly who they are.